budgeting perspective. My name's Sarah Cowan and I'm the Director of the Scottish Women's Budget Group. And I'll be introducing some of our work before handing over to my colleague Heather, who will run you through a kind of deep dive of the review that we've done of our budget review. It's great to see some names and faces that we recognise from other events and for training that we've run, but also to see new faces joining us at the Scottish Women's Budget Group. So just as a bit of background into the Scottish Women's Budget Group, we've been around for 25 years this year, but for the majority of that time as a voluntary group of women who undertook analysis of the Scottish Government budget process from a gendered perspective. 5 years ago, though, we became a constituted charity with the aim of progressing gender equality through gender budgeting. And we do this through research, training and advocacy work. We have a specific programme of work with local authorities funded through the Scottish Government's Equality and Human Rights Fund, which means that we can provide training and ongoing support to council officers and councillors on gender budgeting, what it is, how to use some of its tools, to support budget analysis and tackle inequalities locally in Scotland. So while we've been undertaking this, we thought it would be useful to review practice in Scotland by looking at the publicly available budget information across all local authorities. This is the second year in a row that we've done this. And that we've undertaken this review. And as I said, Heather will share what we found and how this links to the key gender budgeting principles. But before handing over to Heather, I'll briefly summarise some of these principles and the role of gender budgeting. Gender budgeting is about considering how analysis in the budget process can help tackle gender inequalities. It's about putting people at the centre of budget decision-making considerations and considering whose voices are heard in these budget processes and how different groups of people are affected by budget decisions. So decisions on budgets affect our lives every day, but they don't affect us all equally. And without the concerted effort, decisions made can entrench inequalities. Women are much more likely to undertake unpaid care work, leading to different experiences between men and women of paid employment, unpaid work, caring and provisioning for others, and use of public services. And these kinds of different experiences stem from gendered norms, structural inequalities, and assumptions about the kinds of jobs women and men do, including traditional assumptions about parenting and caring. Often budget decisions can entrench these assumptions and inequalities, but public spending and revenue raising can be used to transform them. And these inequalities mean that men's and women's different experiences currently mean that women are more likely to experience poverty at any stage in their life than men, have lower levels of savings and wealth, and are less able to increase paid work than men due to caring responsibilities. Overall, women are more likely to be in lower paid and insecure work, are twice as reliant on social security, and have lower and less access to pensions. So gender budgeting is about bringing a gender analysis to the budget process. It's about recognising the differences between men and women, but it's also recognising the different experiences between women and making sure that analysis is intersectional. Gender budgeting does not mean separate budgets for men and women, but it means developing a budget that can bring about fairness between men and women. And a key component of this, hopefully been heard already, is about making care visible, making care work visible. So gender budgeting challenges assumptions that budgets are gender neutral, that the decisions made in budgets can make a change to inequalities positively or negatively. And it's through a process of analysis that examines how public resources are allocated and how these have different impacts on men and women. Gender budgeting uses tools that are used across councils, such as equality impact assessments. There's policy analysis tools and data to reveal the different impacts of women and men and between different women. Crucial to gender budgeting is having time and resources and capacity to conduct quality analysis. So to achieve this analysis, there's a need for sex disaggregated data to be incorporated into policy making and planning. The better the data, the better the analysis that there can be, and we'll share some thoughts on that as we go into the review. And access to intersectional data, which takes into account the different experiences between women, will provide better informed analysis. But gendered budgeting doesn't need to be a complex process, but it does need to be robust and based on this data and analysis and a common understanding on concepts and principles. Um, I've already, within this, there's some key principles to gender budgeting, and I've already highlighted some of these, such as the need to take an intersectional approach, the need to take into account unpaid care work, and we will keep saying that across this hour, the need to take a lifetime approach to the view of the impact of policies. While we've been undertaking the review of budgets, we specifically focused on some of the top ones on this slide. We had all the principles at the front of our mind, but we specifically focused on some of the top ones on this slide. So we were looking to see that budgets across Scotland should be transparent, so that elected members, civil society, and the public should have access to information about budget decisions, that they're participative, ensuring that meaningful engagement in the budget process can be undertaken by people across society, that they're outcome focused, so that budget decisions are working towards linked outcomes that the council's aiming to achieve, and crucially, that they're working and making decisions that will advance equality. So it was through these prism of these principles that we reviewed the 32 local authorities in Scotland, and we conducted this review as what we'd like to say as a critical friend to policymakers, councillors, council officers. So we've highlighted where we see gaps, but also where we see good practice that exists across the country. And we've also set out some core questions that we feel are important to consider through budget processes for women to be seen in budgets and for gender inequality to be tackled. So with that, I'll hand over to Heather, who'll share some of the findings from the review we conducted.
Brilliant. Thanks, Sarah, for that. I'm just going to share the briefing in the chat as well, so that people have access, try it again, so that everybody can have access to the briefing, the findings. But also, just as we're going along, if anyone's got any questions, please feel free just to either put your hand up and ask as we're going, or put them in the chat, and there'll be opportunity to clarify things as we're going along this morning. So as Sarah says, we looked at all 32 local authorities' budget papers, looking at it from that perspective of how easy was it to access the budget information, how easy was it to understand the budget information, and the transparency in relation to explanations behind decisions. We looked at it in relation to how participative was, so were consultation processes used, and if they were, what did they entail, and how, and importantly, how were they used in relation to the decisions that were taken, and could you see that link? So could you see the questions that were asked within the consultation process? Could you see how they were used to inform the decisions that were taken by elected members during the budget setting process? We looked to see how outcome focus, one of the things that for me, which I think in terms of why gender budgeting has the possibility of being transformative, is that it's about an outcome focus. It's performance and results orientated. So looking at how clear those links were between what councils are trying to achieve and the budget decisions that were taken. And the last thing that we looked at was in relation to how were equalities considerations taken into account. And as Sarah says in the briefing, we have tried to highlight some areas of good practice, as well as, I suppose, highlighting areas where there are some, for us, particularly coming at it from a gender budgeting perspective, where there are concerns in relation to the way in which we the way in which equalities are considered, and particularly the way in which women are seen, and in which unpaid care is seen within the budget process. And I think it's worthwhile saying, and as Sarah says, we will mention unpaid care probably quite a few times through the session. But I think it is worthwhile highlighting, just to start off with, that when we looked at the budget publicly available information, only one council out of 32 councils identified that their budget could potentially disproportionately impact on women. And to us, that was quite surprising, given the changes and the proposals that councils had agreed in relation to changes in relation to things like early years, in relation to community transport or school transport and school travel, changes in relation to, that were care related. And yet only Stirling Council actually, within their budget papers and within their equality impact assessments, recognised that women were a group who could be potentially negatively impacted by the changes that were being proposed. All other local authorities, they identified that it could impact on young people, they identified potentially that it could impact on disabled people, but women were invisible. And we would contend that that's got a lot to do with the fact that unpaid care and the responsibility for that is invisible in society. And there's an expectation, because of those norms and stereotypes that we have in society, that there will be someone there to pick up that responsibility. And it's just assumed that that's what women do, and therefore we don't see that often within the policy context and within the analysis that was carried out. So that, I suppose that's kind of one of our kind of overall findings, was that women in unpaid care were often invisible within the budget process, even within the quality impact assessments that we were able to access. So there's something about that analysis that is being carried out, and about the fact that we are missing that component when we're looking at the impact of these decisions that are happening. So in relation to transparency, so last year, Sarah was off on mat leave and we were down a member of staff. So I had the joyful pleasure of going through every local authority's website and try to find the papers and the information related to the budget. And I think of myself as a relatively, technologically savvy ability to find information on the web. But I have to say, some councils' websites can, you're tearing your hair out. It is not easy to access information on a number of councils' websites. They're pretty inaccessible. You've got to click through numbers of pages to get to the document that you actually need. And then often the papers or the information that you want are contained within papers that are a couple of hundred pages long. So, for the general public, I think there's, in terms of them being able to access that and being able to understand it, we don't make it easy for them. But I question how easy it is for councillors and elected members as well, in relation to that level of information that you're expected to be able to to read, to understand, to digest in a very short period of time, in a very dense format as well. So there's, I don't think we make it easy for your constituents and the electorate. But I'm not convinced we make it easy for elected members either, in terms of the format of the papers and how they are actually that information is provided. And the Accounts Commission, in their report this year, they also highlighted that, each local authority does it differently in terms of what information they provide, how they present that information. So actually being able to do a real comparison in each local authority is very, very difficult, because the information that's presented, how it's presented, the level of information that you get is very different across the 32 local areas. I think the other thing that can be difficult is that often because sometimes the way in which information's presented is that you'll get administration budgets, you'll get opposition budgets. You'll sometimes in councils they've worked together and there is the one budget, and that's a lot easier to be able to understand. But there'll also be information where there'll been proposals made that have maybe not been accepted, and actually being able to really figure out, well, actually, what was agreed as part of the budget process isn't always easy to do from the papers that are available and from the minutes, but also in relation to the way in which budget decisions are reported. And I get, that at the moment we're often not making popular decisions. Therefore, we want to put a shine on it when, that corporate communication's happening, I suppose. But it can be really difficult to understand, for an individual to think, well, what does this actually mean for me? How is this going to impact? What are the changes that are actually happening? So transparency, there are, there were, as I say, a number of kind of themes that came out when we looked at it around how information's presented and the clarity around that information, that people were able to just go somewhere and say, right, actually, these were the decisions that were taken. Aberdeenshire Council is one of the areas that we kind of said was probably one of the better ones in terms of they've got a budget savings page, which sets out on their website that presents information on the budget proposals broken down by service. And it also provides a link to the budget reports and the integrated impact assessments. So theirs was one of the better examples of that information being available on one page and being kind of readily accessible, but also having information about what was agreed and what wasn't. So that was one of I suppose the ones that kind of stood out in terms of better practice. And Stirling Council, their information on reserves, they included some information about their earmarked reserves, what it was being used for, and also and clear information about where they were moving things out of earmarked reserves and why they were doing that. So again, that was quite easily, quite straightforward to understand. Whereas other councils, the information around reserves were less clear, I suppose, in terms of what was happening in relation to those. One of the things for us in terms of the transparency process and the Accounts Commission, I suppose, I'm losing my glasses, which would not be good, is highlighted is that, one of the things that's really important for councils, given the financial situation that they're in, is that actually that the planned savings are actually realistic and will actually take place. Now, one of the things that, in terms, I suppose, one of the principles or one of the mantras, agenda budget, and that you often will hear us talk about is show us your workings. Can you see from the information that's provided that the savings or the proposal that is set out has enough information in it to actually be able to be assured that that the evidence is there, that the numbers add up in terms of the proposal that's been made, that the savings will actually come from that. And I think for us, we did have questions when we looked at some as to how realistic some of the savings that had been identified were, and I suppose it's that thing about because often when we looked at the papers and the impact assessments, they're very much just looking at the proposal rather than potentially taking that wider lens to think about, well, if we do this in this area, how does that impact on something else? And is that going to lead to increased costs, further down the line, or is it going to lead to increased costs in another part of the balance sheet, if you like? And that was, I suppose, one of the things that I think that we are. When you look at the budget papers, when you look at the proposals, it's very much that by service area, often without kind of thinking about, well, actually, what does this change mean? And one council area, one of the proposals, and this wasn't accepted, but the kind of changes that they were talking about making was in relation to making savings around housing and making changes in relation to hostel accommodation. but and reducing the amount that they were paying there. But it was that thing about, if you do that, well, then what does that mean in terms of the use? Because you're not necessarily doing anything to reduce the number of people who need to use temporary and that kind of accommodation. Does that then mean that you're then relying on bed and breakfast and things like that? So actually, are those savings that we're saying can be made by cutting this, are they actually realistic? And the information sometimes within the proposals are, in terms of what's publicly available anyway, is quite limited. So that lack of showing your workings to actually be able to assure yourself that if you're making savings or you are agreeing increase in charges, what is that actually going to bring in? But what's the potential, increase in people not paying this, and how does that impact? That information wasn't available in the publicly available information for the majority of for all councils, I would say. So there's something there about that, again, that goes back to that analysis and that quality analysis and the information that is available to be able to really think about, okay, so what are the consequences of the decisions that we're making, and who are they likely to impact on? In terms of participation, 20 local authorities ran budget consultations ahead of making decisions last year. Okay, so ran budget consultations ahead of making decisions. Those who did it, the 12 who didn't, says that they were using previous consultations to inform this budget process. So of those 20, 7 didn't publish any findings from the consultation that they carried out. So while they carried the consultation out, there was no report, or there was no public report available of what that consultation process said. And obviously, for us, we would say that if you're going to be doing a consultation, it's really important at the beginning that we think about, well, how are we going to use this, and how are we going to report back to individuals who've taken part, or to the public in general, and say, this is what you've told us and this is what we've done. And even if that's about, actually, you've told us you don't want us to do this, but we're going to do it anyway because of such and such. I suppose it's about that transparency element, isn't it, in terms of that there may be times when you're having to take decisions that people don't, are not keen on, but if you can set out your rationale behind it, sometimes that can make it, it can make things a bit easier in terms of that public discourse, and trying to, I suppose, combat a lot of the kind of misinformation that there can be in the public discourse these days. We looked at 7 of the kind of online questionnaires that councils ran last year. We managed to have a quick look at 7 of them. And of those 7, 3 didn't collect any demographic data at all about the people who were completing the consultation. And I suppose, again, one of the things that we'd be saying is, if you're doing any kind of consultation, we need to be asking people for demographic data. Yes, individuals have the choice not to complete it and to fill it in, but if we're not asking for that demographic data, then you don't know who's taking part in your consultation processes and who's not. So who are the voices that you're not hearing from? But it also means that there's no way of being able to do any kind of disaggregation whatsoever in relation to that. So the 2 councils are the ones that we looked at, East Lothian and Moray, both asked some kind of information, also asked, as well as asking for demographic data, they also asked a question specifically around equalities. So how, if you've got any, how would this impact on you and on your household, and whether there's any kind of equalities considerations that need to be taken into account. Whereas the other 5 that we looked at didn't have any kind of equalities related questions in the consultation. And of the 13 who did publish findings, 3 councils did attempt some kind of disaggregation. So East Ayrshire and the Highlands and Scottish Borders each tried to to do some kind of disaggregation of their results, which was for us was encouraging to see, because I think it is important that we try to look at what are different groups, what are different people telling us, but also I think, you know, thinking about who aren't we hearing from, and that was one thing that was missing from all of the consultation reports, was that nobody had considered, well, who isn't taking part in this, whose voices aren't we hearing. But while there were those three councils who attempted to disaggregate the results, one of the things that was difficult to be able to see was whether how that budget consultation had informed decisions that were taken, that link between the kind of proposals that were made or the consultations that had been carried out, and how that had been used to inform the decisions taken wasn't as clear as it potentially could be. And I think that's something that if you are running, budget consultations, is to think about, well, how are we going to use this information, and how are we going to report back to people in our communities that actually this is what we've done with it, and this is how we've used it to inform our budget process. And I think that link's really, really important, particularly if we're going to try and, I suppose, build trust within that kind of the public realm, basically, is that if we're asking people, that we are then going back and saying, well, this is what we've done with what you've told us. And that might be saying, actually, you know, because of the financial situation that we're in, we heard what people were saying, we've decided to do this, but we've put these mitigations in place based on what you've told us. It's not about not necessarily taking decisions or doing the things that you need to do, but it is about keeping that communication going. Otherwise, what will end up happening is there'll be consultation fatigue, and people will just stop taking part because there's no point, because you don't listen to us anyway. You know, you'll have heard all of these things, yeah. So it's really important that when we're planning these kind of consultation processes, that we are thinking about, well, what are we going to do with this, and how are we going to report back? And in relation to the kind of outcome focused, as I say, for us, one of the things about gender budgeting and why it has that potential to be transformative is because it actually gets us to think about what is it we're trying to achieve, and how does the way in which we raise money and the way in which we spend money, how does that actually help us to do that? In terms of looking at the information within the kind of budget papers, there was a small number of councils did explicitly refer back to their council plan, or consider how the decisions would impact on the delivery of the council plan. And one council explicitly considered the impact on their equality outcome plan, which again is an improvement from kind of last year, and it's something that we would be saying that your equality outcome, or your equality outcome plan, your equality mainstreaming plan is a document that you have to have as part of public sector quality duty. That should be being considered through your budget process. What are the budget decisions and how are they impacting on that? One of the things that was quite that did stand out and confirmed some of the work that the Carnegie UK had done, which was that during the budget process, there was no explicit consideration of the impact of budget decisions on the national performance framework and the national outcomes. I suppose it's that thing about councils have are meant to have due regard, and I suppose it's about, well, what does due regard actually mean, and how is that being implemented in practice? But certainly from the budget papers, there was no explicit reference in any that we were able to find. That was somehow. So in terms of advancing equality, and I suppose, one of the things that we would contend is that, when we're in the situation that we're in at the moment and difficult choices are having to be made, is that it's even more important that we are considering the equalities impacts of the decisions that are happening, so that we're able to consider what mitigations need to put in place, or potentially are there things that we need to do slightly differently? And I suppose also that again, the Accounts Commission talk about this all the time, but about considering about that opportunity cost, and about thinking about, is this the best way in which to use the resources that we have? But it's really important that equalities are considered. And in terms of, kind of impact assessments, which is the way that often councils will use to consider equalities, I think the reality is that from the work that we've been doing, both in relation to these budget reviews, but also the work that we've been doing with councils, is that impact assessments are of varying quality, but we would contend that the analysis that's contained within them is often not robust enough. And there's a number of reasons for that, and I'll go on to explain some of those shortly. But from the publicly available information, 14 of the 32 local authorities did not publish impact assessments along with their budget papers, so they weren't publicly available. Of those, 8 said that were available on request or had been provided to councillors, but you couldn't just go in and find those. Now, again, we would contend that in relation to public sector equality duty and the guidance by the Equality and Human Rights Commission, is that actually those documents should be publicly available. If you're meeting your duties under public sector equality duty, then your equality impact assessment should be publicly available. They shouldn't just be available to councillors. It shouldn't be something that you have to request. You should be able to go in and get that information. And I mentioned at the very start, of those who did publish impact assessments, only Stirling Council identified that proposals could have a disproportionate impact on women. And that was despite the range of changes and proposals impacting on things like education, early years, all of which have really kind of gendered impacts when we think about particularly unpaid care. So when we looked at the impact assessments, there were a number of areas of concerns. And I suppose in terms of both the impact assessments, but also the level of detail that there was about the proposals that were being made within the publicly available information, one of the things that stands out is that there's a complete lack often of demographic data being used. If there are numbers in terms of number of people who are likely to be affected, then that's it. You'll get 100 people, but you won't get who are those people, what communities are we talking about. There's a real lack of data that within the equality impact assessments that we looked at, and that's one of the major issues. If you don't have that data, how can you do a proper analysis to understand who's going to be impacted by it? So one of the things that certainly we would be recommending is that that's a definite area for improvement, is that about how we use data and the demographic data that is available. As I say, that lack of analysis, so where there is evidence cited, I often say that, one of the things that we're really good at with an impact assessment is we're good at admiring the problems. So we'll put evidence, we'll put research, we'll put reports, but then what we then don't do is join the dots to think about, well, what does this actually mean for the thing that we're proposing, or what does this mean for the area? So that lack of analysis. There was limited focus on, as I say, outcomes in terms of, well, how is this actually going to impact? What difference is this going to make in terms of what we're trying to achieve and what our, whether that be your council plan or your equality outcomes, but also that kind of little consideration of that longer term impact. The key focus is obviously on balancing the budget for that year. And I suppose one of the kind of limitations that we have within our budget process is that year-on-year budgets, which doesn't allow for a huge amount, even though there's the kind of medium-term forecast and things like that, the actual budget process is just focused on that 12 months and about making sure that the columns in the spreadsheet add up within that period. So that kind of being able to think about, well, what are the longer-term impact of proposals? There appears to be little consideration of that. Lack of consideration of how proposals will impact on other service areas. There's a real kind of, when you look at these things, there's a real that siloed approach that I'm looking at my one bit and I need to make sure that things add up there, but actually maybe not considering what does that mean for other areas. So one council that we've been working with that we looked at, they had a proposal to make changes and cuts to school, out of school, the kind of holiday programmes, and their mitigation was that community groups would be able to pick that up. But another service area was making cuts to their grants to community groups who provided those play schemes and activities that potentially could have picked up and mitigated for changes that were being made. But there was no kind of crossover, there was no recognition that that change in one area would have an impact on another area. So we need to kind of be able to see that, I suppose, that cumulative impact and think about across kind of across service areas. There was a lack of consultation in relation to specific budget proposals. So while there was, budget consultation obviously often had happened, in terms of the information and the impact assessments, there was a lack of consultation with people who would be potentially directly affected by the proposal. There was very little consultation had been taken in relation to that. Often mitigations or the kind of proposals were based on, I would say, untested assumptions. So that assumption that another organisation or another part of the council or would be able to pick up and manage any changes that is, any demand failure, if I suppose, in relation to the changes that we were making. But we would say that, in terms of those assumptions, they often weren't tested. So there was no kind of, again, going back to that consultation, it wasn't like anybody had gone and checked to say, right, okay, well, we're going to do this and we think that this will lead to increased demand for you. Are you able to pick that up? That level of, so we were taking mitigations as read, basically, that there would be other people there. And in terms of that lack of monitoring impact on people, when the impact assessments looked at how they would monitor the impact of the decision, it was very much about budget monitoring. We'll monitor whether we're making the savings or not. But there was little consideration of what monitoring was needed to find out if there were any unintended consequences of the decisions that we were making. So thinking about that is something I think that's important. We've mentioned earlier about that failure to see women in unpaid care. And we would say that, there's a clear pattern that even when proposals clearly had gendered implications due to the impact on caring responsibilities, they were not seen within the impact assessment. And I think, for us, that highlights that collective failure of society to see the value of care and the role that that plays in the inequality experienced by women. Women's role as unpaid carers was invisible in 31 of the 32 local authorities budget processes last year. If we're talking about addressing gender inequality, then we need to start seeing that, because if we don't see that, then we're not going to be able to address those issues. And I suppose it's that then the knock-on impact that then has in terms of you're trying to address child poverty and trying to address your growing the economy in terms of the work that you're trying to do around employability and all of those things that you're trying to do for your communities. If we don't see unpaid care and we don't recognise it, then we're not going to be able to sort all of those major issues that as councils you're trying to deal with. One of the things that we wanted to do was to provide a wee bit of kind of case study. So there's quite a few councils last year made changes to around kind of school crossing patrols. So getting rid of the lollipop person, basically. And when we looked at, so in a number of areas, there was no equality impact assessment for it at all, because the council had used a screening process and had decided that there was no equality impacts of it. Where there was equality impact assessments carried out in relation to school crossing patrollers, then often what you got was that it was the parents' responsibility to get their children to school, and therefore that was fine. There was no recognition that there are varying, that overwhelmingly we still have that disproportionate responsibility for children, and childcare falls on women. That was completely invisible within it. So we had a go at thinking about, right, okay, if we were to do a really good impact assessment on school crossing patrollers, then what are the types of things that we would want to be considering? For us, it's that demographic data to think about what are the needs of different communities and areas affected. So some councils got rid of all crossing patrols in all areas. And, for us, that's, it raises questions about yeah, just in terms of that lack of seeing the distinct needs of your different communities, and about how inequality impacts on the needs of communities, but also how it impacts on life chances. So one of the things that we've put there is that we know that the rate of traffic collisions involving children walking or cycling is more than in the 20% most deprived areas is triple that than of the 20% least deprived areas. So if we're taking that kind of broad brush where we're just getting rid of these across the board, then actually we miss some of that nuance in terms of how inequality impacts on different communities. We would have wanted to see some consideration of how proposal will impact on unpaid care and who undertakes that unpaid care. How that impacts on safe routes to school, and how that will support travel to what will be needed to support travel to school. So yeah, we cut the school crossing patrollers, but is there additional costs needed in terms of street maintenance to make sure that routes stay safe and things like that? Consideration of how the proposal will impact on climate change, net zero, and how it'll impact on communities if additional car travel is required. But also really thinking about data on travel patterns in the areas and what that means for safe routes to school, but also data on the demographics of the staff who will be impacted. Those are the types of things that we would expect to be considered within an impact assessment around something like this, to be able to really understand the impact of the decisions that we're taking. There was of the impact assessments that we were able to look at, none of them included any of that data, which raises questions, as I say, about the quality of the impact assessment processes. One of the other things that highlighted during the review was that there's a real misunderstanding about what achieving equality of opportunity under the public sector equality duty actually means. And I've put a couple of statements that we saw within kind of budget papers, and also in relation to the quality impact assessments that were seen within papers. So basically, proposed changes apply equally to everyone who receives a service. Therefore, there's no equality considerations. Well, tenants with protected characteristics living in council housing will be affected by the proposal increased rents. There'll be no difference in the treatment of tenants who share a protected characteristic and those who do not. And the current inequality stemmed from some families benefiting from council subsidised childcare where others were not. So the way in which we think about equality is the way in which we think about equality of opportunity. And those are just a few examples. There were lots of others, particularly in relation to when councils were increasing charges for services. And again, that lack of demographic data to understand who uses these services, who potentially is going to be disproportionately impacted by that. Because if you're already on a low income, then actually increasing charges will disproportionately impact on some groups and other, and it's more likely to be women. But there's a real misunderstanding, I think, about equality and what that duty to advance equality of opportunity really means. So I think there is definitely there is some that it highlights the importance of local authorities ensuring that there's a high level of knowledge and understanding within their staff and elected members about their duties under the public sector equality duty, but also about that understanding about what is equality of opportunity, and about it doesn't mean treating everybody the same, that we need to recognise that some people are coming from different starting points, and therefore because of that this will have a greater impact on them. Cumulative impact, few councils did try to do cumulative impact assessments, but the problem was that the initial assessments weren't great, and therefore if the initial assessment's not good, then your cumulative impact assessment isn't going to be great either. And the fact that lots of the initial assessments didn't identify sex as a protected characteristic that would be impacted means that they weren't seen within the cumulative impact assessment, which is why only one local authority identified that their budget proposals could impact on women. So in terms of kind of some of the recommendations that we've put in, and these are what, rather than saying, oh, you should have training and things like that, we do have that within the report, that we think it's important that about, you know, that capacity within councils, that there's a really good understanding of, you know, around kind of that responsibilities under public sector quality duty, and about how to do good impact assessments. What we're suggesting is that, you know, that we've set a number of questions that, you know, as part of the budget proposals or budget processes, local authorities should consider the following questions. And that is about, how will your budget proposals impact on the outcomes the council or the policy areas aiming to achieve? What do you know about existing inequalities of outcome in relation to that budget area, and how do the budget proposals, how are they going to help address that or potentially exacerbate it? How will your budget decisions impact upon different people and places? What is the different impact of the budget decisions on women and men? And really making unpaid care visible. About, you know, really asking, is there enough information in the budget proposal papers to confirm that the proposed savings are realistic, or that in the investment areas, that, you know, the areas that you're choosing to invest additional money in, that is actually the best way to help achieve the council's priorities, about that opportunity cost that the Accounts Commission is really kind of highlighting that we need to be considering. Asking ourselves a question, could the budget be used differently to better address existing inequalities of outcome? Does the budget consider the cumulative impact on different people and places? How will the impact of the budget proposals on disadvantaged groups be evaluated? So how are you going to monitor for unintended consequences? How have the results from public consultation been used to inform budget proposals and decisions? And has the budget information been published in a way that is clearly and easily accessible? So those are some of the questions that we would kind of would be saying that local authorities and as elected members, that it's important that you're asking yourself about your budget process. Does it? Are you able to answer those questions? And if not, then I think there's potentially room for improvement, or there's work to be done, if that makes sense. Yeah. So I know we've only got about 5 minutes left, but has anybody got any questions that they want to? Oh no, we've not. We've got 10 minutes.
Thanks, Heather. And we've got some questions in the chat already, so I can run through them and give a starter answer, and then give you a chance to have a wee break, and then you can jump in with answers as well. And if anyone wants to ask a question, if you can raise your hand, so we make sure there's time to come to you as well. So in terms of questions, Holly had asked if the consultation from Glasgow published the findings of their consultation. I've had a quick look at the notes that we made on this, and we couldn't find a published consultation from that, Holly. So that's quite a quick response on that. And Heather is shaking her head as well. So no. The next question was around guidance on what groups of the population to identify in the breakdown of demographics when you conduct a consultation. So I think we'd recommend that you would look at protected characteristics, and a question around socio-economic background as well, to sort of encompass different demographics people might be experiencing. I'll round up another couple of questions together, and Heather can come in on them as well, and then we'll come to I can't see whose hand's up, but we'll come to Trish. We'll come to you as well. So, in terms of the other couple of questions we'd been asked, if we would be sharing individual data to each local authority area for a chance to go into a bit more detail around concerns we had with each area, and a further question on getting a sense of our opinion on whether officers preparing these papers and budgets are aware that they are skipping important equality analysis, but doing it for reasons such as time, budget and pressure, or whether it's genuinely more training and development that would help. I can start answering them and then hand over to you, Heather, if that sounds okay. We hadn't been intending to do an individual breakdown or any kind of private papers to each local authority area. If if you would like to speak to us as to find out a bit more about your local area, then do get in touch with us and we can share it. Just the process of getting that information to we could have a chat with you about it rather than having to produce papers for each local authority, just in terms of the level of work that would require. And then I suppose a starter on opinion on why on where it can come to. I think I would probably say it's a mixture, but Heather might share more. But a mixture in terms of resources and capacity, like having the time, space, and data to do the analysis, as well as the capacity to use all those things in the right way to really put the analysis into practice. But I think from some of the examples Heather was sharing, there was clear examples of misunderstanding around what equality and equality kind of outcomes is that would require training and development more than anything else. But Heather, I'll hand over to you.
Yeah, I think there's, so I think there's a couple of things there. I think there's a real, it's that thing about we're in really difficult financial times. We absolutely understand that. But equality or equality concepts are being used as, and we've seen this in a couple of local authorities that are being used as a way to justify decisions that are being taken that we know are going to disproportionately impact on disadvantaged groups, if that makes sense. So like that one, like where everybody will have to pay the same, or the disadvantage is that some people can access subsidised childcare and others can't, which is, again, it's that whole thing of, that if everybody can access something, then it isn't, it's fair. So it isn't fair. It's that whole thing about, I think sometimes when we think about equality, people still think of it as pie, isn't it? And if I get my bit of the pie, you can't get your bit. So I think there's still there's a wee bit of kind of misunderstanding there. But I also think it's that thing because officers are probably aware that there's a chance, we're more and more, we're seeing members of the public use judicial review as a way of challenging decisions and things like that, that we're seeing, I think, some concepts around equality and around, like some of the IGB ones that we looked at, using words like, maintaining independence and things like that. But ultimately, it's just guys for leaving folk to on their own, pretty much. It's the way in which there is a misunderstanding, but I think there's also, I think there's also a move to how do we justify decisions that don't sit comfortably with anybody, but because of financial factors, people are feeling that there's no other choice but to make these decisions, I suppose. I think there's also something in relation to that. We are blind to women as a society. It's quite clear that there's 31 local authorities did not see women in their budget process. They did not see women in their equality impact assessment processes. And there's something there about that collective failure, about that because women make up, 52% of the population, we're not a minority group, but we are a disadvantaged group. And I think it's that thing about the things that cause that inequality around caring responsibilities, because there's just that general assumption within society. We're well versed in equalities and in kind of gender inequality and all the rest of it, but still we replicate some of this within our households and our relationships and our families and things like that, because that's what we are socialised to do. So the fact that people, officers and elected members and things like that don't see it is because it's invisible, because we don't value it, and we just assume that somebody's going to be there to pick it up. And often it's women who do that. So there's something there about that collective failure to see, to make that link between caring and care responsibilities and women's inequality. It's just generally invisible within society. And Claire, I'm not sure whether training in and of itself is enough to do that. I think we need to really be making it visible within our impact assessment processes and making sure we're asking that question. Because if we don't, it'll just disappear and remain invisible, I think. Sorry, I don't know if that answers the question or if I've just ranted. Apologies. Trish, do you want to?
Yeah, it's easy to rant on this because it's such an unseen thing. I wonder if we don't look at childcare in such a way that really gives it equality to everything else. Because the one thing we don't do is to allow a parent to parent their own child unless they can afford it.
Yeah.
So if we extended the childcare payments to include somebody staying at home to look after their child, I think we would start to see a change in how it's actually viewed, because then there would be a price on it and it would be valued to a different extent. But it's a huge task to actually change that culture.
Yeah. Yeah, I think you're right. I think it's, and it's the same with social care, isn't it? That, that if someone else is doing it for you, then they get paid for it. But if a family member support and a parent or someone else, then you're economically you're classed as economically inactive, and you're a drain and a burden on society. No, absolutely, you're not, Trish. Yeah. So there's something fundamentally needs to change about how we see unpaid care, and I suppose it's not an easy change, but certainly one of the things that I would be saying is that add that as a question into your impact assessment, add it into your budget process somehow. What is the impact of this on unpaid care? Because if we don't start making it visible, it'll continue. We'll continue not to see it.
If I could just come back on that, and another thing, you have to think of the way we work as human beings. If you're going to put your child out to care from the earliest possible moment, how can you expect at the other end of the spectrum, when your parent gets older, for that child to then look after the parent? Because they're going to say, well, you put me out to care, so why wouldn't I do the same to you? And that in itself will have a cost on our budgets.
Sarah, do you want to?
I was going to ask, firstly, the phrase "invisible woman." There is a brilliant book written by a renowned feminist on that very topic, that the world's designed by men, basically, data. I bought it for my daughter a few years ago. But yeah, has any analysis been done? Because a lot of the problems here might be that, that people in positions of authority in local government are mostly men. Is that true? Officers and people making decisions who they just wouldn't think of this kind of stuff. The kind of stuff that Trish has just talked about. Just a simple thing about the crossing patrol. It's the mothers who are going to have to say, okay, I'll start work at 10 because I can't get, otherwise I'm going to have to drop my child off and I have to drive again. And we've got a climate, emissions stuff and all of this kind of. And it's a simple policy on paper, but actually with massive implications. And it's a resolvable problem. It's a resolvable issue. But, I can't believe the effort I'm going to try and get at the restoration of a crossing patrol for one primary school, which is the biggest primary school in my ward, or one of the biggest in Highland. Duh. And I think it's that. I just genuinely think it's men are making the decisions, and it's always a battle. Local members, it's always a battle.
Yeah, I think it's I think there's a variety of things. I think it's that thing about we as women and men are socialized to accept those stereotypes and those norms and expectations, and I think sometimes we just don't see what we just don't see things that are but they're just the norm, if you like, so therefore we accept them. And I think so there's Andrew saying that in Aberdeenshire the head of legal and head of finance are all women, so I don't think it's necessarily that it's just men don't see it. I think we don't see it either, because it is the norm. It's that baseline that society expects, and therefore the Caroline Criado Perez's book is that it's that the default is that who picks up unpaid care is women, and therefore that is our default acceptance, if that makes sense. So it's that thing about we need to be challenging that, challenging that acceptance that that's how it should work, but really understanding that that is the link and the crux as to when we talk about women's inequality, that's often where it comes from, and that if we don't see that within our policy context, within our budget set and context, then actually we're making life harder for whoever it is that's doing that caring responsibility. And you know, and yeah, it may look like on paper that we're making savings. So the kind of school crossing patrollers, yeah, it looked, you know, on the budgets, it looks like we're making savings. But actually, our, you know, and in terms
Yeah.
of when we think about, you know, the knock-on impact, the whether that be in terms of that kind of the economic activity in the area, if people are having to give up jobs, or actually if there's accidents that are happening, the kind of, you know, that wider impact, if there are then, you know, calls on your grounds maintenance people to have to cut hedges or to do things to make sure sight lines are clearer, actually are those savings being made in the way that we think? And I think it's that siloed approach that we often take as well, which is unhelpful. So if, you know, about really kind of trying to think about how do proposals that come from one service area, how are they impacting on other service areas, is a really important thing that we need to be considering as well.
I must admit, with local members, we kind of we do that. Whether it hits the spot, you know, is frankly another matter. But yeah, you've got to look at the big picture. That's a
Yeah.
really helpful session, by the way. Thank you so much.
No, it is.
I think that's us at time now. So I just wrap up. If there's any last minute questions, pop them in and we can always get back to you by email as well. But we hope you have found this event useful, and thank you for attending and engaging with it. As I say, if you have any follow-up questions, please do get in touch with us, and we will be sharing a recording alongside the link to the briefing. So we'll send that round after the call. We understand that this year will be difficult budget processes again, difficult decisions needing to be made, but we hope it's been clear from what's been shared that we believe gender budgeting is for these difficult times as well as better economic times. One thing to highlight as well, the last page on the briefing has a kind of aid memoir for councillors, so we hope that can sit beside you while you're looking through your budget papers and have some of these useful questions that Heather's referring to, then just to keep these issues front of mind. And I think that's all from us, just to say good luck in the forthcoming budget deliberations. And we hope that you can see the impact on women and maybe see some improvements from what we reviewed last year. But hopefully you get the chance to ask the questions if it's not there. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Heather. Thanks, Sarah.